All right, 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 all right. Slow day, slow day. Mm. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Ooh. Probably gonna be slim pickings. What's going on over here? There's like a little tiny gap. That looks right. Weird end of the day stream. We'll see how it goes. To be honest, just seemed like kind of redundant today. So didn't want to do it at first because I thought it's kind of silly to go out and do a stream when you sort of talked about everything you need to talk about and it's just sort of following through with price action. But I think it'd be a good day to do some other stuff and like take some requests. So if you guys want some tickers analyzed, then I'll try to do that today. I think we've got plenty of time here to kind of work through it. I'm gonna do myself a favor and check some stuff on AMC, and then we'll get moving forward. So good afternoon for those joining. Yeah, a drop before the pop. I don't know how long for AMC and GME it may drop. Could be the end of this week, could be next week, but it's definitely likely that it was already like in the books, in my opinion, that we were going to see this second move up and then come down. So if you didn't follow yesterday, that's kind of the general recap, was that you would have that push up again yesterday, sort of I said secondary push up. I think it's a good way to put it. And it's probably not a better way to put it. So, and then my expectation was we'd probably come back down, and it looks pretty darn close to a lot of the original expectations we had. So there was a post that I made a while back, and I think it was on the Discord, but it was about a chart that we had built out early on. And I talked about this kind of a bottom and where we've seen it before on AMC and what you may have as an expectation if it were to come low. And there was a few things, and we've kind of gone through every single bottom the same way. Like, could it be the bottom? Could this be like, it, or is there going to be more? And I think that the overall picture has been one of fairly consistent 2 to 3 days out. We've kind of gotten it right. But there's a difficulty in understanding this kind of movement without understanding maybe iterative movement. And so, like, to be fair, there's been times where I've kind of backstepped and been like, hey, I'm confident about this, but this could happen, and then it kind of sounds like you're backstepping, and I think that's fair. That's a fair criticism. I was thinking about that the other day because I posted something in the Discord, and I said, look, this is kind of what I thought might happen, and it looks really close so far to what I think a traditional bottoming action should look like on AMC. But if I just left it there, it just kind of makes it look like, oh, well, I mapped it out perfectly. I got it right, like 100%, and there's nothing else to it. That's not really accurate because there's been like plenty of back and forth. So if you've been on the stream like consistently, you know that each time we kind of approach one of these bottoms, there's a moment in which you could break out. And another thing that I was kind of mentioning in the Discord group yesterday was that if you're aware of what that looks like, then it's not really a great mystery. And we talked about this yesterday with the IWM versus AMC comparison. And it's weird because, sometimes I do these things. I say weird, but it's just kind of one of those things in the back of my mind. Like I'll have these days where I do these comparisons and then I'm thinking about it and I'm like, that was really important. And I wish that this was something that I had addressed earlier, when there's more ears on it or whatever, eyes on it, so that people can see it and understand it perhaps a little bit better. And it's a challenge to go about every day and try to like anticipate price action. That's fine. No one's complaining about that. That's the nature of what I'm doing. It's like charting and stuff. But when you get to these kind of decision moments, this is, I think, the area that's really hard to get through. It's like a mental wall at first. So originally, like when I started doing charting for AMC, and just getting to the point, it comes back to this idea of these creek crosses, right? And specifically jumping the creek and what it looks like versus not jumping it and what that looks like. And there's a sense in which every time this happens, there's a bit of uncertainty because your operator has concealed motives, and like as best as you can tell, you don't necessarily know what those motives are, but as best as you can tell, like you might get it right sometimes. And this is where I think some people, they excel, like they kind of are good at maybe estimating where ultimately that price is going to end up. And a lot of it may be, again, bigger picture stuff and just kind of recognizing like, well, this is a bigger picture setup, and you've got a huge amount of space that has to be retraced or this or that. And so the smaller term stuff kind of melts away and goes to the side. And I'm all for that. When we look at the big picture stuff and just kind of analyzing it and saying, big picture, there's a lot more going on here. And we did that. We went through it maybe a couple of streams ago, and we did the big picture wave analysis. We actually started doing that a while back, and we started doing it back in July. And it's easy to kind of sweep it under the rug because when you look at the short term, it's like, well, the short term has this kind of taint to it. It's like tainted, where you're like frustrated because the short term keeps failing. And it's really hard because every day we talk about things and it's like, well, if this failed, then what does that mean, right? And it's like, well, we had that on the chart. So you're comforted in knowing that, okay, well, we had it on the chart, but at the end of the day, like, the disconnect is, again, where that creek doesn't cross, and then what that means for the bigger picture. And like lately I've noticed that I'm having like trouble being careful, I guess was what to say, with my words, so that I'm not doing a, like, well, I told you so, or something stupid, where it's like, yeah, I did, but there's also, it's hard, I think, when people are not watching every day or doing this or doing that. It's like, it's kind of like a blip on the radar. And it's not really fair to expect that folks would necessarily remember those things. But I want to point out that it was about, what was it? So it would have been September 23rd or thereabouts, which is when we were coming down here. And I mentioned somewhere before then, but we had this chart on the screen. And here, let me open it in the other window so I can make it bigger. And I guess a lot of times there's a sense of confusion or frustration when something doesn't seem to go the way you want it to go. And like yesterday, we had a really green looking Monday, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, well, it's not really green, right? It's just retraced and it actually broke lower. And you could get kind of frustrated by certain things like that pretty easily if you're not aware of maybe what that possibility was. And so I've been trying my best to kind of go back and say as much as I can, like, hey, this is not unusual. This is kind of what was expected. And when we look at this map that I did on like the 23rd, which is before it broke down, I had drawn out during this time this setup, which has a drop down to basically this range at 430 to 440. And then I'd imagine that it'd probably come back up pretty high, like it'd come back up and test that 460 area. But after that point in time, it's kind of like, meh, I don't really know if it's going to stay higher or if it's going to go lower. And if it stays higher, you could hold maybe 450. 450 was not held. So it starts looking a whole lot like this kind of yellow setup that I had. And what that comes from is it comes from a basic Wyckoff schematic. And I know I've talked about this quite a bit on this channel. I know that it's something that probably gets kind of tired. We talk about it so much. But the idea is very simple, which is that you're basically creating, in a lot of cases, you're creating like a hyper compressed range. And usually when this works out in our favor, it's very volatile looking. You get something that resembles like a Wyckoff-ian range where you'll have, that's not a super fancy term, it's just like 100-year-old system of understanding liquidity, but you'll have like an auto reaction, and then that breaks out sideways and you get the phase B top, and then it goes down. And this is typically what happens, is that you come back down, they'll leave a gap or something, which they did. They left a gap back here at 440, and then typically you'll come back down, you'll test the gap, probably bounce off of it, and then you'll try to go for like a localized spring. Now, the way I'm drawing it, it kind of looks almost exactly like the 2020 model, right? And so this is what I drew over here, and I estimated it would be somewhere between that 430, 440 mark. I wasn't really sure if it would hit 440 and just stop there, go slightly below it, or whatever. Or if it was going to basically capitulate a little further and go down to 432. It ended up being about 435, which is fairly accurate in terms of that bottom. And then you would expect there to be another low. Why? Because it left a gap. So you're going to retrace back down. And then typically, just like we saw back here on September 4th, once you reach the floor, you're going to continue to try to press down through it by raising the price up, flowing through a distribution cycle on the top of the wave, and then basically doing it again. So how long could this go? Could you do another one of these? Yeah, I mean, you could. And I had done a diagram saying, I think at the same time, I think it was around the same time I actually did that other image, that basically was like, hey, this is an iterative kind of thing. Like you can see it continue to do the same thing over and over and over again until it's done. And it's kind of confusing and frustrating because you're like, well, when does it stop? When does it stop? When does it stop? Well, that's when we use the big picture. And so this idea of like, what was just set with the comment was, so it's like a pop and then a drop, right? And the concept of that is not completely wrong. But I drew it on this image, I think, actually, and you can see like that movement could happen like repeatedly, and it can happen within a like a micro range where it kind of eventually becomes an LPS and it doesn't go, or it can happen where it's continually making springs. AMC likes springs. It's more often than not gone for the spring. It's very, very, very rarely gone for an LPS. An LPS is the last point of support. I mean, very rarely. The issue with that is that your expectations, it's like, it should be like 89% of the time, or 85% of the time, it's going to go for the spring. Maybe 15% of the time we might see that LPS, but it's probably stacked even farther than that. And that's because this is like a heavily sold stock. There's a lot of selling in this stock, and we're doing a turnaround right now and that's offensive to people, and they think that people aren't selling or whatever. Some people think that. It's like, no, it's not that complicated. There's institutional powers that hold anywhere between like 30 to 60 million shares at a time. And when they sell, it's really intense, And then there's also like plenty of people out there that are day trading, and then there's plenty of people out there that are shorting. And all of those are just things that can cause a lot of extra sell pressure. And so the point of all that is just to say, like, this stock has had a continuous kind of pattern of selling down in times of question. It's usually more or less safe, I guess you could say, to consider it to be more bearish in terms of how it interacts, even in an accumulation, like even in the midst of an accumulation. And so that pattern that I drew right here, it's kind of a dance, right? There's a dance with it, which is that essentially, like, as this pattern continues, the expectation may be that, oh, it's going to stop right here. And yesterday when we were talking through everything, and this is just kind of to summarize again, maybe if you weren't here, if you just kind of don't remember it all, to summarize everything, essentially, like, it has to make these jumps. Those are the confirmations. And until it makes those confirmations, even if it's breaking creeks, which is a good sign, and it's been pushing resistance once, twice here. That's good. There's nothing bad about that. That's a positive sign. Okay, but even in the midst of that, you can't count out the possibility, and then work that into it as a probability that it could still continue to drive low. So one of the things that people really hate to hear, I've found, is the concept of springs within springs. And I think it's as simple as, it's not really, it sounds complicated. It's not really that complicated. Like, every range is a fractal, right? It's a piece of a larger puzzle. And the larger puzzle, until the larger puzzle's finished, all the little smaller pieces are like lemmings. They just kind of follow out. And there's no magic bullet that says, like, this is exactly when this is going to necessarily stop, except maybe the biggest time frame that you can pull. So that's sort of the best that you can do. And we've been doing that since the beginning of this. The problem is that it, at least to our eyes, the way we understand things, it seems that it has expanded. It feels that way, right? Because you're like, yeah, well, we looked at this and it was definitely like a mirror image back here. It was. Maybe that in part is to mislead retail to think that the wave is complete. Maybe in part something changed. Like, we don't really know. And it's kind of silly to sit here and speculate. But on the big picture, what we do know is that it hasn't yet made the big move, and that every time it's had that opportunity, it hasn't made it. And then so you're waiting for those iterations to finish, and you're kind of considering the biggest time frame as, this is the stop. This is the farthest it's going to go, most likely. And then you're using the smaller time frames to help reinforce that. And that's what I did yesterday. I went through and I looked at the biggest possible time frames. I looked at the comparison with IWM. And it kind of brought about some unsettling results, because basically it brought about this idea that it could be that it's about to break out, but it may very well just delay on the very principle that happened last time, which is this concept of, like, back in May, and this is also what happened in 2020 with the SPY and the rest of the market. As they're doing that cross up on the M cross, which is what I call that kind of wave that jumps the big creek, as they're doing that, AMC's rejecting and heading low. And this is what I was trying to say in the, I made a really long comment in the Discord group. I don't think it's going to necessarily resonate with everybody. But it's really not that complex. Like, every M is a potential S curve. And so if it breaks out, it's like an S curve, right? And when it doesn't break out, it turns into one of two things. Either it's distributive, right? Which is typically going to be like a fake out move that then drives the price low. That's usually what that looks like. Or in the case of it's still bullish, which does happen, then sometimes this just turns into like a normal, I don't want to say normal range, like there's such a thing as like a perfectly normal range, but it can just be as simple as that, like where it just didn't advance. And so you're really working through a series of questions that you have to answer about, all right, well, if it didn't advance, did it go too high? Did it do something distributive? Sometimes, even in the way this looks, it can be like, okay, I don't really think it's distributing. Like, that's what happened to us in November of 2021, is that for most people, it didn't look like a distribution, because it hadn't done any kind of major distributive moves until the very, very end, where it tried to kind of advance and then just sort of failed. And then ultimately, what happens after, potentially breaking down here? There's a lot of questions, right? There's always like an uptrend, and we call it like the ice sometimes. It's like the rising trend, right? And what's strange is that this can totally be a phase B reactive move. And this is what frustrates people, I think, to no end, is they don't quite understand when I'm talking about things, and it's hard because I'm trying my best to explain it, but they don't quite understand, like, what is the difference? Like, how can you see the same thing over and over, but then have different results? And a lot of it's just very simple range analysis. Like, what happens when it's trying to move across the creek? What happened before it even approached the creek? And this is the kind of stuff that I think needs to be more mainstream in our culture and our community of trading and understanding. And so I've maybe trying to do a better job, because I'm talking about it again with people on the Discord, and I'm like, yeah, this is kind of hard to explain, but it shouldn't be, because it's very simple, So when I look at the big picture, this kind of stuff has been happening more often. This kind of stuff has been happening more often on the S&P over here and IWM even. Okay. I hit the wrong button. Hang on. Where's that little and thing? So more often than not, S&P IWM has been doing this kind of bit where it crosses up during that S curve. And so you get that breakout moment here. And then AMC has been doing a lot more of this kind of stuff. And it just depends on the overall motion. But this is just far more typical for AMC. It's either going to go down for a spring or it's going to go for a distribution. And again, how do you know which is which, Booksy? You look at rules of the range, right? Like, did this have an auto reaction already that was adequate? Did it create a phase B top? Is there a very clear and evident phase B bottom? Has it broken out, in ways that are unhealthy? There's a lot of things here that can determine whether this is distribution or what we would call accumulation, the breakout. And sometimes it's really straightforward. A lot of times it has to do with whether that auto reaction makes like a low first. Does it make like a super new low when it auto reacts? That could be a sign of weakness that you're going to head down lower. We have something similar to that here, and this is a debate point, because some people would look at this and say, oh, I think this is the auto reaction. And if that's the case, then it came lower after the auto reaction. AMC's weird. Sometimes it has selling climaxes after the auto reaction. But is it better to have that or to have it kind of just react and then stay high? Well, that's what I think happened here. I think we got that reaction, and then we developed a bottom, we crossed, and it looked like it was going to take off, and it just didn't. Then the range builds out, and you're like, man, this is pretty long, and the phase B ends up being really, really long term, and this is the creek, right? And so one of the things we look at when we look at this big picture, and when you want to see this, what's happening today, understand it in light of the bigger picture here, right? If this is your auto reaction, and the whole thing's an auto reaction, where's your phase B top, right? I don't know. It's kind of confusing, right? But the point is that if this is your phase B bottom here, so this is your auto reaction and your top and your phase B bottom, then it never came back above that phase B top. And all the rest of this, as weird as it might seem, because it looks like there's been so much that happened, really, I know it sounds weird, but like all the rest of this should be considered, because it's just now approaching that bottom again at 430. All of the rest of this would have to just be like a phase B. Like it's possible, very possible, that it's super, super, super boring, and the other question is, well, what if that's the auto reaction support, and this is the phase B top, and the phase B top's actually lower? Is that possible? Sure it is. it's not, nothing here is like so set in stone that it can't be one way or the other. But you have to kind of then take the whole range as you would. And then there's going to be the debate about whether or not this is actually, excuse me, bearish in the end, if this is a sign of weakness. But I've contested, and I still contest, that on the whole, I haven't seen anything that indicates this is overtly bearish. All I'm seeing is that long ranged kind of middle. And when we look at reaccumulations, right? Reaccumulations after, it's called a reaccumulation after a descent. I can't remember what it's called. You can see there's a chart, a couple charts here that you can use, and maybe there's not a great perfect way to do this, but this is kind of like a decent enough example of one right here. So this is like what you see is a buying climax, and then there's, a support. Obviously there's a build out, but then this is like that long, boring, like creek jump that hasn't quite happened. And notice that doesn't come back above that previous top. So after this early reaction down, there's this push up, right? And then you kind of build out a long-term creek, right? Until you can try to advance again. Does this look fairly similar to like what we're experiencing right now? Yeah, it's pretty similar. And I don't think I don't think that's wrong. I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it. And so from that point of view, like, I don't really have a lot of complaints. There are creeks that are jumped here. You can see this one early on is jumped. I think we've done that kind of movement, and we're just waiting. And we don't know if we're going to get a jump across the creek before we spring, but we're already and that's what we were thinking about back here. We're already thinking in terms of the right things. So when you look at the big picture and you're talking about these waveforms and all this stuff, the way we do these measurements may seem a little bit odd to some folks. You may look at this and say, well, I watched yesterday, I don't really get it. Why were you using this as like a main, wave cross? And then where is the 50% supposed to be? I mean, are you supposed to be using that? Are you supposed to be using this? Blah, 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 blah. It all has to do with the build out and how that, again, has built out as a range. And ultimately, like, what's the distance you're trying to get across here? Whether or not it has to be even, don't think is really a big question in my mind. It doesn't have to be even. But typically speaking, when you have an up wave and a down wave, it's usually a reactive thing. So the first wave kind of sets the tone for the second. And then especially if it's a breakout, it can be really slow until like the last second, but the timing is usually pretty accurate. So we could have it, again, sort of meander on the bottom and then have a really rapid rise all of a sudden. And that's what we were examining yesterday, was like, man, there's a lot of ways you could go about jumping this creek in the end. And frankly, even though it's really frustrating, this concept of iteration fits really neatly into this analysis, because you can look at this and you can see like, well, until it jumps those creeks, you're still iterating. Like, you're still doing the same general thing you did up here. You're just doing it lower until you get that accumulation that then reacts, right, and jumps the creek. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about accumulation, is like, it reacts, it jumps the creek, and then the triangulation of that is that it comes back up. Here's the wave, up, down, up. It comes back up, and it reaches back towards the top of the range. Until that happens, there's no reason to think that it can't iterate again. And what that would look like in our particular situation would be, let's say it came down and it bounced here and it went back low to 434. In and of itself, that's enough to say like it could go. But it's a could question, if question. It's not a guaranteed question. If you're very confident about the range, you might be very, very confident that it's going to go and say it is a spring. If you're not 100% sure, if something happens in the early part of the range, like it comes too high, for example, that could be an element that throws a little bit of a wrench into it. And then you look at this and you're like, well, if that's a spring on the big picture, could that have a spring within a spring? And the answer is yeah, totally could. Is that frustrating maybe to some folks because they're like, I don't get it. You said it was a spring and now you're saying it's not. Well, yeah, But I mean, like, this can continue to iterate in a quote unquote spring-like motion. And this is what ultimately gives you what appears to us to be typically like a falling parabola, that bounce out, bounce out, bounce out. And it's like, what's going on? It's just like a bouncing ball going down the stairs or a slinky going down the stairs. It's like, it's probably that they're continually pushing it down until they can't anymore. And there will be a point at which, if this is an overall on the big picture, right? If this is a macro accumulation, I don't care what anybody says. I don't care. If someone thinks that this is just indefinitely going to stay at 5, I don't agree, because at some point you've finished the range. There's no longer an adequate amount of trading. Your operator is going to move on one way or the other. And if they're going for a spring, they're going to keep pushing it down, right? And trying to do sell tests until they can't anymore. There will be a point at which, when this tries to react, or when this reacts, it no longer can push low. And this is where you start getting the major change of character, right? Where you may have had, up until this point, you may have had a series of rises that just continually like fail to break out, right? They continually fail to advance. And this is kind of what's been happening on the way down here. And you're like, man, I'm so tired of it. Well, it creates this like fan, right? Coming down as it rotates and goes downward. And there will be a point at which that no longer works, and that's kind of the big change that you're looking for right now. So like when you look at today, it's down about 1.5%. And all I can say is that this is totally expected, and that you're only going to get one of two things here. You're going to go ahead and drive the price low back to the floor, which is the whole point. You wouldn't do all this at the top unless you were trying to drive the price back down. You wouldn't go and list sellers. By pushing this above the top of the range here, they're trying to enlist sellers, period. So you see how this works? Is like every time you're pushing up here, you're going to enlist sellers. If you have enough sellers to drive the price down below the floor, you're going to probably do it. Like, this is the nature of the spring. All right? And the thing is that every time you do it, you're probably going to get diminishing returns, and that's normal. And the best way to look at that is to look at it as a series of walkdowns and see if those walkdowns are increasing or decreasing. Usually there's a point at which in the spring you get a rapid increase as you approach the big picture floor. That happened here. You get that rapid increase in volume and pressure, and that's good. You want that as you get down towards the bottom. You do. Because at some point you're going to have a reaction, and that reaction is not going to be another low, and then you're going to start seeing it kind of build out, and you're going to go back up and you're going to test previous ranges, and as this happens, this is where we start seeing something I call an ascending accumulation, because it's really where smart money finally kind of steps in. And typically what we see is that this is a bit of a ramp back up, meaning it starts off kind of building out slow, and then all of a sudden you get like a major break here, and then it just rockets, right? And I've talked about this ascending accumulation before, because what it should look like and what it typically looks like is a series of creek crosses that don't back up. They don't go backwards. So the reason that we see this phenomenon that I tend to call like a rising accumulation motion is because you're getting like smart money buy-in that is like building out, right, as they kind of cross back up into the range. And a lot of times, again, we might look at this like on the micro, and people think that's a huge waste of time. At different points, I've heard people say stuff like that, like, oh, it's a huge waste of time. Why would you do that? Well, because at some point in the grand scheme of things, it is going to turn around. And typically what we see is that this approaches whatever final creek there is out here. And there's probably a series of other ones that I didn't draw, right, that it's jumping over and so on and so forth. But usually it gets to the end. It pushes the final creek. You get a last pullback. It feels bad. But usually this is like the one that is where the big buy-in. And then this is really where This is honestly, to goodness, this is pretty much where your smart money is actually buying in, is way up here. And this will be like a final creek cross, you know. And you got to think like big picture, okay? How fast could this happen? Well, normally we've talked about this about 9 to 12 trading days, because it's fairly consistent on AMC. I don't know if there's some kind of rule that it has to be this or that. I don't really care. I think it's just a matter of timing. Like typically it takes that much time because there's a lot of days in here. Like this might just be like one day. This might be day 2. This might be day 3, day 4. And that happens, I think, in part because they're trying to not take it off too quickly. So they're allowing time for those kind of backups to happen naturally. So you'll see like high volume in the morning and then it'll just die off the rest of the day. High volume in the morning and just kind of die off the rest of the day until it gets to the top, and then you enlist a lot of sellers again. It tries to drive the price down, but it holds and then it just takes off. And this has happened in January. If you go to the January model, you'll see something very similar to this. Usually it happens after the spring again. This could be part of a much bigger one, you know, that I'm not drawing out here. But typically this happens, and then you'll get that build out to the outer part of the range. It looks a lot like this. So these creek crosses, I call them like an ascending accumulation. They're really just like a final accumulation. This also happened in the June run-up. This also happened in the March run-up. And to a certain degree, this happened in the August 2022 run-up as well, though it looked a little different, okay? You might note that this is pretty similar if you go back and you kind of examine like the bigger picture here. Because a lot of times this looks pretty similar to what we've talked about before as this kind of like bounce-in bottom. And that's important because like when you look at this, you're like, oh, it's completely different than everything else. No, it's not. Like, it's actually really similar to everything else we've talked about. There's a lot of times you'll start seeing this shrinking iteration business after the bottom's been formed, after you've created like that big push up. This is essentially what you get in March. This is essentially what you got right before the run up in January. It just depends on like how steep is this. And this should all look very familiar. Ignore the fact that I'm not trying to connect it to where we are now. I know it looks like it connects, but just ignore that. I'm not intentionally trying to do that. I'm trying to show you that this is no different than like the main motif we've talked about, which is this like really simple, almost iconic for me now because we see it so much. This like really iconic looking build out here, you know, which we've talked about, I don't know, dozens of times. This is what's happening on the macro as well. And these are the same. This is the same thing. I mean, it's no different. This is that build out at the bottom. I used to call this like a t-test, I don't know why I called it that. I think there was a reason back then why I had that terminology, but it was like I would look for the 1, 2, and then the 3. But it really was just an M cross. Like at the end of the day, like that's what we're talking about here, you know. We're talking about a big M cross. We're talking about a simple Wyckofian setup. So when you look at the Wyckoff schematic and you go back and you look at these schematics, you're like, I'm not really sure I understand completely what's going on here. Like, it's all the same. And really what it comes down to is whether or not this particular moment here crosses versus not crossing, right? Does it cross versus not crossing? I mean, that's the big question. And then, if not, is it distributive or accumulative? Okay? And that's the question that you really have to answer. So, yesterday, we talked about a lot of big picture stuff, and I wanted to just kind of come back and just get back to that overview. I think it's a really important concept, and I think it's something that gets kind of lost when I draw a diagram, because you might think, well, it's a wave, or it's this, or it's that. It's all the things. It's all a wave. It's all a, you know what I mean? Like, it's all pieces of the same puzzle. Like, it's not different things. It's a wave, it's an M cross as we call it, it's a creek jump. That's how you advance, right? Or a creek fail to jump. It's a, when we talk about waveforms, we're talking about big S curves, right? Like, all of those things are all the same. It's not a multiple choice question, but it's all of the above, right? It's all those things, because that's what it is. Like, if we go to a Wyckoff schematic, that's what we would see. We would see a wave. We'd also see a creek cross. We'd also see an M cross. Like, all of those things are the same. And when I talk about those things, I hope you guys understand that they're all the same, and that's why in the midst of all this, I think when you're on here like every other day or so, I think it's easy probably to be a little bit confused. Like, well, he was talking about this before, and now he's talking about this. It's probably the same thing. 9 times out of 10, I haven't really changed very much, and I'm just talking about the same concepts. And that's why I showed you that diagram, and it's really like the same. It's really the same thing, like that we talked about here. It's like, well, what are you drawing down there? I'm drawing a Wyckoff schematic. Why are you drawing it there? Because if that's where the spring happens, then that's where the buck stops here, right? Like, at some point, it's going to stop continuing to do that. So what I'm doing is making an estimation, thinking it could stop continuing to do that here. I said the same thing back here, but I was very doubtful back in September for a number of reasons because of the way it entered this range. And then the fact that it had an immediate reaction meant that, and it then started to distribute, immediate reaction going to FOMC for that matter. And then it just felt like, yeah, it's not looking great. Looks like it could be an upthrust with a pushback down. Again, why? It waved up. It could easily come right back down. There's plenty of room here to come back down and go down and check the creek after FOMC. Be a great sell the news moment. That was all theory. But it's based on the concept of like what happens when you jump. Does it hold? Does it reject? So on and so forth. And then, yeah, you're using intuition. And when we looked at Friday the 13th, that's really where the nail, I mean, it's kind of a funny, I said nail in the coffin, like it's Halloween themed or something. Coffins, Friday the 13th, woo! But it's like, it's weird now. It's like looking back, it's like, yeah, that's where there was a disconnect between, on Friday the 13th, that's where the disconnect happened. And that's where the S-curve kind of builds out. It does a jump on IWM, and it goes and pushes highs, and it jumps the creek, right? And we're waiting to see if it's going to come back down and retest it, whereas AMC did not jump the creek, and it rejected and came back lower. And it's just the difference between these two things. Now, for timing purposes, all I can say is that like what we've noticed, as best we can tell, is that there's some kind of a correlation between probably what we think of as like OPEX, right, which is the coming about of a bunch of options, expiring and all this stuff, the third weekend of the month going into like the first and second week of the next month, things like that. And there's a lot of people that do a lot better analysis on that than I do. So I'm going to stop talking about that right now before I kind of overextend myself. But I've heard some really great analysis based on those things. And it seems that there's sort of a disconnect between, there's no disconnect, between like this and this, except for just timing. And so if it's accumulative, here's what we've noticed, right? And this is what happened. Again, I'm doing a gentle recap, and we'll kind of move on from here. This is what we noticed, is that generally speaking, what AMC seems to do is that when the market on the whole is crossing over and crossing upward, AMC's kind of like going back down for the spring. So instead of just flowing upward in like an S-curve, and it's here, folks, it's not a mystery. Like May 15th is where the ETFs hit their high, at least at this time, right? It's where the Russell 2000 comes from a bottom and then hits the top. Comes from a bottom back here, mid-April, and then hits a top on May 15th. If you do the measurement on AMC, it works out pretty much perfectly along that trend. I mean, it is not, again, it's not really a big question. It's a very simple question. It's easy to see visually, like it's there. It's built into the trend even. But the difference is that AMC doesn't have a nice S-curve build out to this, does it? It just doesn't do it. It could have. And I think that's where maybe we have some disconnect, perhaps, is that, well, you say it could have, but, does it really ever do this? Sure. It just doesn't happen very often. I mean, it just doesn't. It happens on the small scale often enough that I use it quite a bit. When we look at pushes upward, we look at the potential S-curves and things like that, and downward as well. But on the big picture, does it happen all that often? Nah, not really. The biggest time that it's ever happened was the giant January to June kind of moves back in 2021. And I don't really see macro picture. I don't really see those big upward S curves very often, unless they're very compressed, like as part of a markup. So meaning like a really tight markup, like after it's left the range, which would have been after it leaves like 350 in this case. So when I look at this, I'm like, this shouldn't be a really big surprise that we didn't see this, come back up. But had it done that, could it have still done basically the same thing? Yeah. But I think in moderation, it may have not ever come as high as it did. This is the whole idea that I developed purely observational, right? It's not like I've invented this, but it was I guess the language is invented by me because I'm a very simple person. In a lot of ways, is that you have a slingshot where you're like pulling back away from what should be kind of like the regular trend. So you get that M shape, and instead of it jumping over, it fails to jump over. And then it pulls back away, and you typically get what appears to us to visually be like a 50-50 cross of that creek. You get this whip around that happens. Now, probably the most specific two places that happened were in the original January run-up and then the March 2022 run-up. In August, you get the same whip around, but it whips around this kind of rising accumulation that happened a really long period of time. It's the same M shape. You still get the M shape. It just was really long-winded, so it's a little harder to maybe visually see it. But you get the same whip around. I mean, it's all there. And it's not hard to see it either. It's pretty easy to track. Like, we can go back to March and do it in a matter of like a few seconds because it's that simple. And I like that because it's an easy to read and interpret setup. So like when you look at this, you're like, well, I mean, is it really there? Yeah, it's really there. When you look at the whip around, it's not only on the line itself, as you can see visually, but it's also, of course, on the top of the range. It's like an SOS as well, and that makes sense, as it should be. It's coming back into a previous range, right? And you're looking at that probably like, oh no, it looks a lot like what we just experienced. Yeah, but we have a very different outcome, don't we? Because this did not come back up down below 50% in our case. It didn't break through that range. In fact, it's way above it, and that's important. This could have been bullish had this held above the top here, and April was where it really broke down ultimately. It wasn't before then. So did it come too high? Yeah, maybe a little bit, came up a little too high, but then when it sold down, it's more about that selling volume and then pushing through that top. But there it is, right? So it's like this concept of waveform, iteration and all that stuff, that's all happening here on the move down. But once the spring happens, there's the rising accumulation. Here's the final creek jump. And then there you have like the 50-50 swing, right? All the way back up through that trend that was established. This is what we typically see in our build outs. Now the same thing applies here, albeit you have to use kind of a slightly different angle. It's more of like a rising. You can see the 50-50 is right there on the top here, but it's more of like the rising channel, not a simple read. It's a M cross that comes from the downside. We could go into that. The same thing applied back in January though. So if you're wondering like, well, I don't think this is the way, maybe it works all the time. I would just say, nah, pretty much is. And it's kind of freaky too how very accurate oftentimes this can be. You know, when you look at this wave down and then you look at the build out and how close to 50-50 that really is. That workout downward, and then this is ultimately where it was going, right? This ends up being the floor. Looks familiar, right? It should. I mean, this ends up building out to be the floor or the ceiling in most cases. You know, it's very similar. So like the difference in what happened in March versus what happened in January is kind of obvious. Is they both have this kind of breakdown, but then January recovers immediately, comes back above the top, and this ends up becoming like a very simple creek back up, essentially, on that cross, and there it is. Okay, so when I look at the current time frame, I'm thinking about all that stuff in my mind. I'm looking at this like, yeah, pretty much did that right here, and then can it do it again? Well, yeah, it can, but this is where things maybe get a little more challenging. I don't want to say the layman. That makes it sound like I'm not a layman, like a common folk, but because I am. But it's challenging because in this case, it's already had a wave up and down here, and then it's got a reactive wave back up. There's no guarantee on this particular wave. We've seen it before. There's no guarantee that this necessarily breaks out and does the 50-50 way up to the 16-17 area. It's just not there. On a clear bottom with the setup, you know, as an accumulation with a clear like double cat ear kind of thing, you can draw it out pretty easily, and typically you'll see the target's pretty easy to see. In our current time frame, it's a bit more challenging. You know, I lean onto stuff like P&F, point and figure charting, in times like this because I know it's a valuable tool. I've seen it work before. I wanted to learn how to do that because I've seen it work before, where it's like given an accurate target. And then I have something in mind, and I'm looking at, okay, well, here's my wave cross down, and then I've got something in mind is like, this is where that 50-50 could happen. And it's just a matter then of interpreting where is the bottom. Right. Well, it obviously depends on timing, right? So if it takes longer, you know, it's higher up or whatever it is. You know, we can keep looking and looking and looking until we're satisfied. But I've done my best to try to estimate maybe where that wave ends and then where it could peak. And ultimately, I think that's the best you can do. You know, you have to look at as best you can the build out. Where's the middle? I think the middle is here, August 5th. That was another key thing that I talked about yesterday was like, yeah, when you look at the grand scheme of this, the middle seems to be the 5th. Well, where's the bottom? Well, the bottom's after this slump here. The bottom would have to be on May 31st. The middle would have to be on August 5th. It's where it jumped, it did the wave up and then broke down here, and it ultimately ends up being the low. That's typically where the bottom is. It's not always where the bottom is, but it's typically where the bottom is after that creek jump as it's breaking down. And there's not really much to say about it. You know, it's kind of like maybe if you moved it around a little bit, it would change it a little bit. But on the whole, it seems to me that this wave is finished. Like the push out and then the cross here, it would be about finished by October 4th. So then why aren't we taking off right away? Well, that's the great debate, I suppose. That's where we kind of get into questions of, again, IWM versus SPY, and that's what I did yesterday. So when I look at this big picture and I see what happened today, I'm not at all concerned because I know that, A, like over a week ago, I was already thinking this would be where we were and what we'd be doing. But B, it's like the only thing I really need to concern myself with the short term is whether or not it's made any advances that are a bit distributive. I already said that I thought this one was a bit distributive. I don't think it needed to come this high. I don't think it needed to come above necessarily to 470. It could have pushed this resistance without breaking any kind of levels. All right, it could have. It could have pushed these creeks without necessarily breaking too high, but instead it came pretty high. So on my radar, when I look at this, the only thing I'm really concerned about is that. And then, where else would it go if we continue to iterate? That's low. All right, where's the floor? I mean, it's down here at 435. What would an iteration lower look like? We don't really know for sure, but we would assume that it would have to be below this floor and that it would probably try to do the same thing here, and it could be fairly low. And I've talked about 425. That's kind of the lowest that I can make the floor reasonably. At this point, we're going backwards now into previous ranges, and you have to start talking about like macro range. Where do you think it actually should be when it hits bottom, right? Can you make the argument about range floors and bottoms and stuff, so on and so forth. And I think that there's a lot of valid arguments to be made. Some people have been saying like 360s, 380s. Some people have been saying 4. I've been largely more positive, saying I don't really feel like 465 is an accident. I think it's the main floor. So I think we're already in kind of that spring-like motion. But if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And if it iterates again, where is it going to go? How would it move? And then, is it jumping the creeks? There's really no reason to buy into this at all unless it's jump the creeks. And this is the other thing that gets me a little bit riled up, perhaps, is like the folks that are just constantly trying to catch a falling knife. It's not everybody. I can't control what they do. I'm not like sitting around steaming about it. But I hear it on the stream sometimes. Like, is the bottom in? Is the bottom in? It could be, but there's really no point in doing that. Like, all it's going to do is cause more stress, and unless there's an incident like what happened in May, but even in May, it still came back down before it took off that day. If you set an alert in the right spots, you're not going to miss it. And most of the time, May is like an exclusion to this rule. It really is. Most of the time, it doesn't just jump the creek with some crazy high volume after hours price action. That just doesn't happen. Every other time we've had big runs, like the 6 or 7 other times where they're huge runs, and then it's like dozens of times where it's been like 50% runs. It doesn't do it with an after hours price move. It just hasn't happened. Have we had gaps, big gaps up, big gaps down? Sure. I'm not saying that doesn't occur. But if you look at it on average and you look at most of those major swing moves that are breakouts, they don't typically do it with like a massive gap up. Meaning there's a period where the spring hits and then it takes several days, 9 to 12. So maybe in my mind right now, there's a little bit of a fear that I have. I don't want to call it like a fear, but there's almost a little micro fear that I have. It's an uncertainty, like, why did the operator do that in May? Why did they change? What was it? Are they trying to just kind of like mix it up, roll the dice, keep people on their toes? Was there a more specific reason due to the options chain? That's what I'm kind of boiling it down to, is I think that's pretty much what the reason was. It wasn't a short squeeze. Many of the larger short positions didn't change during that move. There's a lot of weird questions that I have. And originally, when I drew out that move to 14, I was pretty darn close. I thought it was going to break out after earnings, and I bought in. But if you were to go back and look at my chart, I was not even remotely close on timing for the final result. I thought it was going to be like weeks to months, because that's normally what happens, like a couple weeks and then build out over about a month. I did not think it was going to be a 2-day move. So why not? Because it just hasn't done that. So there's kind of a weird back of the mind kind of curiosity. Like, if we ended up coming down to a spring on Friday, is it possible, Booksy, that we just like take off and like just rip through these levels? And you know what I mean? I guess you never say never in the market. That's a dumb thing to say. Never say never in the market. But what I think would be a better indicator for us is, instead of worrying so much about what if AMC takes off, what if this, what is that, it's just, where does that happen? And are you really going to miss out on the majority of the move? Anything that happens within this range here, I think is fair game for buy-in. And I mean, at this point, if you're getting shares, everything below 5 would be considered the lower half of this range. If you think it's accumulative, anytime it comes below 5, it would be a buy. Like that's the way you would treat it if you're just trading the range and you're looking for the markup. If you're looking for options, then you really don't have to worry too much. They're not going to change that dramatically. You can always buy leaps and just wait. Like way out there, they're not going to change very much until the markup or markdown happens. Like they're not going to drastically change. They might slowly shrink a bit, but it's not like horrible, right? If they're leaps, it's the folks that are kind of looking for that big buy-in. It's like, yeah, I know that you don't want to miss out on that first volatility move, but you don't have confirmation until then. And ultimately, once it gets above 5, that's it. I mean, there's not going to be like, if it, you know what I mean, like it's one or the other. It's gonna, once it gets back to that confirmation zone, you're either going or you're going to distribute. I mean, it's that simple. And even waiting until then, you might think, well, I'm going to miss out. It's like, nah, you're not going to miss out. That's still like a 200% move. You're really not missing out. The notion of trying to catch a spring here, it just doesn't make sense unless you're looking at long term. Now, you might be saying, well, then what's the point of doing all this timing stuff if you don't want to time it, Booksy? Maybe it's a way of, again, trying to give retail a leg up that we don't normally have, like a heads up, like just to pay attention and be alert. Like when we see a breakdown and you're like, okay, it's breaking down, it's going to take several days. It's going to take another week. That's the time of, all right, let's just set some alerts and chill out and not worry about it too much. When you get to these places where there's possible crosses, that's when you want to be alert and be ready. Because if you are somebody that wants to invest in the shorter term stuff, you need to be aware of like where that could happen. So for me, it's not so much about the perfect timing, like getting it right every time. It's just like be alert. Like this is the time when there's possibility, right? This is the time when there's perhaps like a greater probability of a larger move happening. So when I looked at this yesterday, I went through all this stuff. I kind of like was excited because I was like, well, I'm getting good results, in terms of like these measurements and stuff. But then I was thinking about it later and I was like, sometimes I don't think I necessarily do a good job. And I'm trying to be better about that, making sure this clicks on a deeper level, which is, again, if I'm not right, then there's no point listening to all this. But if I'm right about the methodology and I'm right about the understanding and how the market moves in these kinds of ways, then it's something that I want to share, and I want to make sure that other folks are on board. Or if they're not on board, we can have discussions, disagreements, and then we can refine ourselves and be better. Because I'm in the process here. I've got personal investments, right? Like I'm not just doing this. I've got personal investments. One of my personal investments is AMC. I'm mostly shares. I've also got January leaps. Had January leaps for $16 and $17 for quite a while. They've not done too well, but I got in them pretty early, and I also haven't really been trading short term. I really haven't traded much short term since July. It's been pretty slow for me in terms of AMC trading. I don't think it's a great range to trade right now. Like the options haven't really been moving very much, whether it's a put, whether it's a long, doesn't matter. I've not seen a great amount of volatility in most of these moves. And then they've been so many like head fakes and fake outs down and up that it feels like they're just kind of baiting left and right. Maybe they're collecting on derivatives. I don't know like what they're doing, right? But the overall picture here is one of phase B nonsense, like slow moving till it's not. So I'm really waiting for that creek jump, and I think we're really close, okay? But I'm not going to be investing anything short term unless we see that move. So if you're wondering about like, well, is this it? Is this the spring? Is this, and you want like a definite answer, all I can tell you is that there's been a couple opportunities. This has been probably one of the better ones in terms of the macro range. Like this is one of the bigger, better opportunities that we've seen. However, the setup as it relates to IWM, makes me feel like it's going to take a little bit longer than IWM maybe will take. And IWM may just very well come down this week, hit this 214 area. And if it doesn't, so be it. You know, it could be very well that this jumps a creek and just starts going right now, because technically it just pushed on a creek and it also is on a floor. If it just jumped the creek and headed above 223 and held support, we'd have to say, is it a distribution or is it going for an SOS? And then it could just go. But I've been talking about the possibility of it coming down first. And I think once it does this, if it manages to do a good check on this creek, it should just go. Like, we may check low, but it really should just kind of go. And my thought is that AMC follows it. It doesn't go right at the same time. So that's kind of been the bulk of the analysis. And I don't think it's going to change very much this week. You know, if we're red tomorrow and we're going down tomorrow, you may not see me come on live. It's usually because nothing's changed. I almost didn't do it today. I felt like I guess I could come on for a little bit and just recap this stuff. Just try to give people like a little bit more information that I didn't kind of get in yesterday. And then maybe take some requests if we want to take some requests. If you guys have interest in something else you want to look at. But on the whole, like, this setup is not bad. It's just fine. Like, it's just working itself out. It's been like the same way that it's been since over a week ago. 2 weeks ago even. Like, we've been talking about this possibility since before FOMC that this may just push up and come down for a spring. And we know that the floor at 440 and the floor at 435 are very important to AMC on the low end. Beyond that, this is where I think, for me, it's like speculation of how low do you think it really could go without breaking too low, you know? And I'm of the opinion that, frankly, if it comes below here, 425 or so, I don't really see why we would do that unless we're planning on, like, dumping. So, like, it's just not a lot of positivity in my book. I see that as kind of the lowest you can go type motion, where that's, to me, where that floor is back here. Other people are going to look at it and say, nah, dude, it's not that complicated. You know, this was the floor at 4 and it bounced and then it held and then it dropped and then it's got to come back down and hit it again before it can go. It's fine. Like, it's okay if people agree or disagree about those things, you know, totally cool. I've talked about this before, and I already said earlier that, like, I wasn't personally like looking for 4 or sub 4 because I thought this was the better floor right here. And I'm going to just stick to that. And if it's wrong, it's wrong. Okay? And GME, guys, those that have been kind of waiting, maybe you're like feeling like, man, he's just talked about AMC for like 30, 40 minutes or whatever, and I don't really want to know about that one, but GME. It's the same thing. Like, this was already in the works yesterday. I mean, we talked about the possibility of this yesterday, of coming back down. It had to hold above 2310. It just didn't. It had a head and shoulder right off 2310. It had to break above this level. I put this on the chart because it's important. And this has been on the chart since we first started coming up here. It was like, it could just go up in gap fill and then just retrace, because it needs to have that M-cross moment and it needs to come back and find support. I hadn't really seen it yet. We got an early sign of weakness maybe here in this drop because it pushed through that trend. Now we're just waiting to see how low it goes. And I think 2150s is fine. That could be an adequate support. I can see that as a really strong area, a strong contender. There's a big creek this way that we jumped over. We need to hold that. If we don't hold that, I don't have a lot of reason to suspect it couldn't come down really low again, because, again, it's an iterative move. You can visually, it's like really obvious. And so the iteration would try to drive it back down low. It may not be successful, but that's what you would expect to have happen. So, and then same thing with MPW. We've been talking about this forever. I haven't really looked at this close up. Maybe this range isn't as bad as I think to seem it is. You know, it could be better than it looks. I don't know. All I can say right now is that I already had an expectation this was going to come back down and sort of check that macro breakout. And yeah, I mean, aside from that, the Monday, October 7th estimations are still there. But guys, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. You know, that's a very strong possibility, just as much as it is that I'm right. I wouldn't say it was a shot in the dark. I did a lot of work for it, but if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. You know, and if I'm right, then it changes everything, which is crazy. But that's the way it is. So, look, WTO, and I mentioned it yesterday as well. So Scott, WTO is kind of it's kind of DOA. It sort of got this push on the 20th, which was a Friday, and that waveform didn't continue. When it broke down at 58 cents, I feel a little bit like a broken record here, but I want to make sure that we understand why this is, because I personally think, yeah, that could have been the turning point. I do think still, even though it may seem a little crazy, I do think, yeah, it's possible that wave was going that way. And there's no evidence to suggest otherwise for me. Like, I was looking through this again the other day, and I was like, yeah, I mean, you could draw this steeper, but the way this had built out with these hooks, it doesn't really allow for it to be significantly steeper. Like, they work at a certain angle, and then they just don't work. So what happened here? I think it's just a failure to continue. There wasn't enough support. There's too much selling. And when it broke back through 58 cents, we kind of knew the writing was on the wall that it was going to try to come lower. And I had talked about maybe coming back down to 43 cents as soon as this turned into a head and shoulder, and it did. There's a 1, 2, and then down here a 1, 2. Once it broke that neckline, all that had to happen was continuation, and that's what happened. It came pretty low. It came to 46 cents, but then it came back up, and they were like, well, maybe it's going to keep going, but it didn't. And it just turns into like an M cross here. So it just looks like cat ears to me. And that kind of stuff, when it's falling, is just like the height of like dangerous trading. Like, there's always a possibility, right? You're always thinking in the back of your head, well, there's a possibility it breaks out. There's a possibility it breaks out. I'll say this about WTO, okay? It has a couple things going for it right now that would indicate to me the possibility of a break soon, but that's about it. So one of those is that it's been wrapping itself around like a finger, like kind of like a snake almost, like coiling around 50 cents. We don't typically see that happen in the market unless that's going to be a really significant level. Like, you don't typically see that kind of wrap, even in a distribution cycle. Like, a lot of times you won't see that in a distribution because it's volatile high. It's actually working off of supply. In this case, it seems to be working off this supply and demand zone. And it reminds me a little bit of what we see on the bottom, like back here on AMC. Like, and you might say, well, yeah, but you already thought that was the case and it just kept going down. Well, yeah, that's true. But this kind of shallow S-curve where it kind of builds out flat, it's usually because it's trying to establish some kind of a floor. And it does this frequently, right, before it kind of takes off. We see it all over the place. I don't think it's a AMC exclusive. You see it in the market. And when it takes specifically a long time to do that, it could be a sign that, yeah, things are kind of turning back up. When we looked at RSI, we looked at MACD and all that stuff, man, these indicators are just super lagging, you know. I wish they weren't. I wish they were obvious, but they're just really far behind. Like, the cross-ups that are happening, or I should say not happening, are important because we've been talking about this since, I don't know, maybe back here, late September, as a possible candidate for a really big kind of quick squeeze move. And yet during that time, the divergence has gone almost completely, not flat, but it's just completely different. Like, there's a dramatic difference between what was going on back here, right, in this build out coming down, for example, on like MACD, and then this potential turn here up to the upside where it looks like it's going to try to accelerate upward and outward versus what's happening now, which frankly, it just kind of looks like chop. Like it doesn't look like anything to me that's regular. It looks very much like a back and forth. There's a little bit of like a narrowing you can see on the MACD, but it's not great. Um, you know, the MACD itself maybe in some ways reminds me of that move that we talk about here sometimes. Like perhaps that's going on to some extent. But you can just visually look at it and see like it hasn't quite made any commitments yet. Now, is it still divergent? Yeah, I mean, this is the hourly. It's still divergent. It's still rising while the price is falling. And you'll see that the RSI is much the same way. It's a bit of a mixed bag because you'd have to say on the RSI that it's more or less like a hidden divergence locally, if anything. It's a sort of a challenging argument because you can see that the rise on that, the steepest rise that you can draw on that moving average is obviously broken. It looks like a cat ear almost, like a wave out. But then looking at the big picture, you're like, well, I don't know, Booksy, like to me it still looks like overall it's pretty divergent. But then you look at the short term and you're like, that's not divergent, you know? So it's like, what is the truth here? I think it's a bit of a hidden divergence is what you would call it, maybe because there's a, to some degree, there's different ways. I know people talk about hidden divergences. I get it. I'm not trying to rewrite the book on it. But I see the divergence very clearly from this top here, which is in August, this bottom here in August to this bottom in September. There's a clear and evident rise. This doesn't look like a divergence here to here locally, but on the big picture, it's still building out. And so the question in my mind isn't like, is there still like divergence necessarily? I think it's still there, but it's more or less like, could this still come back down again and be divergent? The answer is yes. Like you could still have this, you still have a breakdown here that comes low, and this would still be a macro divergence. And so there's a real possibility, even in the midst of this, like, all right, it's wrapping around 50 cents, seems like a strong level. Will they make a nosedive for a bottom? Where would they go to do that? I think, again, pretty straightforward. If you're looking at this as a 50-50, that it's probably aiming for what you would suspect here is that it's probably aiming for this bottom at like 38 cents or something, or 40 cents, which really coincides with this kind of double bottoming of this trend here. And it hasn't happened yet. So the leg down seems fairly imminent. It doesn't necessarily have to happen, but we'll see, you know. And then you can look at the local range and decide if you think there's a breakout. I don't really think it's worth investing in this, you know, at these levels unless you see that move back above 50 cents. Because at this point, it's like, how low does it go? Good question, you know. So it's got a couple things going for it on indicators, and then another thing it's got going for it is the fact that it seems to be building out some kind of a strong level of support around 50 cents. So if it can manage to push back above 50 cents and hold it, it's probably going to act as like a springboard, which is positive. There is a lot of possibility that it makes a move, again, up to these particular rises that I've got here on the chart. One of them is red, the other's not. It's right here. And these are both possibilities. Could be both, could be just one. So from where it is, like, could it swing pretty easily to 55 cents? Yeah. I mean, and if you're swing trading this, it may be worth it to you if it jumps that creek because it's a 20% move, you know, and it may be worth it to you if it jumps that creek because then it could be a 40% move, right? But if you're looking for like the bigger picture swing, it's got a lot to prove now. Like, kind of has to make those moves backwards, and then it's really abandoned a lot of these early pivots and trajectories. It did not follow through. Well, that's all there is to it then, right? Yep, pretty much. Like, the middle is still around $1, you know, of this S curve. It didn't ever go back, so you might think this is like a delay. The fact that it's still divergent maybe is a positive. Maybe it's just delaying that move back to $1 or waiting. You know, if they suspect that they can get them to do another reverse split or something, then bears might do that. You know, it's a timing thing. The other thing that this may have going for it is a slight widening. So like locally, um, there's this like kind of mild widening that's been going on ever since September 23rd. You can see here that there's a bit of that going on, and I don't think it's the best necessarily example of it, but there's a bit of that going on. So what about the waveform? Yeah, I mean, it should be done. And you can see like that cross up, it seems like the wave should have broken out here, the M cross, and it just didn't. It kind of stalled out. So I'm not really seeing, again, a huge amount of recovery here on this move. That looks really strong. You just kind of have to take it for what it is. This could be a sleeping giant that's about to explode, or it just could be a dead play. Like sometimes the volume being so low isn't always a good thing. You know, like when people look at it, they're like, oh, the volume's really low. And I'm like, yeah. I mean, and it does seem like it's kind of pushing down in a little bit more of a weakened manner. But it did reset RSI quite a bit. Now there's a lot of space. It's just one of those plays where I feel like it's safer for me to just tell you what I think is the best, and I think what's the best here is just to be patient. You know, if it crosses these creeks, great, but it has a lot to go. I don't think it's a bad play. I'm still invested in it. I didn't invest that much. I don't really care. I mean, it sounds weird. I don't really care that much if it goes down a little bit more even. But I think for some folks, they already got out. And I think that's very respectable, because back here when it broke down, I kind of warned people in the Discord. I said, you know, if it doesn't hold that, it's not necessarily great. And then you've got the setup right after, which looks like head and shoulder, which is not necessarily great. And I hate for people to just hang on to something that they think is going to break out and it just keeps bleeding down. Like, that would suck, you know. Nobody wants to see that. I don't want people to sit there and think that it's got to go back up, you know. There was a lot of similarities between this and AILE, and then it changed. Does that mean it can't go? No, it's just different now, you know. So I'm looking at it as if this were to break out, like where would it probably go? And the reason I drew this up to about 55 cents is because if this is a slight widening, and I think it is, this channel down, it could be like a flag where it breaks back up and goes back to the top, which is about 55 cents. It makes sense to me, no pun intended, that would happen, because you're getting back above that floor to test 50 cents again. But then you have to still break it. We've also got potential here for like a triangulation that's happening. That could be farther out. This looks like October 7th. That kind of falls more into line with like the greater market here. We're talking about October 7th on IWM and AMC and stuff. That's really where that triangulation seems to be likely happening. This is 3 points, 1, 2, 3. It looks like that waveform specifically broke down and hooked right there. So I think it's an important point. Even though this may be like a penny stock, there's still a lot here that's kind of obeying. It's like it's obeying its own rules pretty well. And I'm seeing that as a potential positive, that it's doing that. So maybe over here, there's a possibility of like a triangulation happening. From a waveform perspective, you know, we would look at this kind of stuff and say, where's kind of the middle of the wave? I think it's debatable, but if I were just looking at this and no one told me anything else and I didn't have any idea like exactly where I thought the middle should be, I probably would position this where it crosses this wave, right? And it would make it seem like, oh, it should be breaking out like right now, you know? And that's kind of been the MO for this thing. It's like most of the waves have been very short term. They don't seem to be very long term. And then the other way I would do this is look at maybe the center mark of this move here, wave up, down, and back up again. You look at the center mark where you think this center is. And the only way I can do that, again, is by kind of looking at, all right, where did it jump the creek locally? And that's probably where the center is. Then we can use that as a measurement tool maybe for the bigger wave, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of the only way you really can look at something like this and estimate timing just purely on the sine waves. And that's assuming a lot. You're kind of assuming that there's got to be a move. There doesn't have to be. This one's really short. So yeah, there doesn't have to be a wave up though. We did the same thing over here and it only got like halfway there. So I mean, it's a tough one for sure. Yeah, to me it looks like it should be eminent, but it's not happened yet. And I don't know how else to look at that. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe it needs to come back and check this guy first. That's another possibility. It's weird. It's like jumping local creeks, but hasn't really bounced off this one yet. It kind of went back through it here. So that could be the end of that. Needing to work itself out. Yeah, it's complicated. So maybe this creek jump is like farther down than I was saying it was. A little bit over to the right. See, I wouldn't have put the bottom down low though. They keep shifting the floor down like slightly. It's kind of frustrating. Still doesn't look like it's anywhere but there. Yeah, so I think there's a bigger potential wave here. And it's really obnoxious because I'm just not seeing it follow through. I wonder. That's interesting. So that's the highest creek right there. And it's from these 2 points on the top. It's very odd. I think there's another one here and here. Yeah, pretty much the same thing. Intersecting there. I don't know. Maybe this is just a bottoming off that creek jump. It's just ugly. And then it did move. It seemed like it shifted the floor down a bit right here. There's a rejection now on 47 cents. So that's another curiosity of mine is like, are we trying to like push it lower in order to, I don't know, do something. This would have made more. I keep changing this, but if I'm just looking at the wave here, this would have made more sense to me. Like this motion there, like that's the jump. So those are parallels, essentially. I wonder if it's just as simple as like a triangle, like a descending triangle. Super simple. Could be 1, 2. This could be very loose. 3, 4, 5, maybe 6. So it's kind of unreliable as a triangle, but there's not a lot of hits. It's very loose, like 1, 2, I mean, I can see it narrowing potentially here, but it's hard to know because if it's a triangle, it could be very much done, like it's already out, or it could be that this is just again really loose and it's part of this widening. It's tricky. In which case, it could come down lower. And then most of the time, triangles that are strong break around 60% of the distance, and this one's way off that. But yeah, I guess if you're looking at it that way and it breaks out low, then a 6/8 retrace can get you back up to. So if it breaks out down here at like 44 cents, the 6/8 retrace gets you back up to this, or 6/2 retrace gets you back up to this like golden pocket area here, 58 cents. So once again, it kind of takes you right back to like the same thing. If it managed to break here, it could potentially come all the way back up to 57 cents. But that doesn't give you like a massive breakout. It's just a simple move. And I'm guessing in some ways, yeah, this is probably going to build out. There. Sort of like a channel would. So you could see a move up to here, and then it may even stop as low as 58 cents. So it's tricky, but it's just the way that it is right now. It's not building out really strong. I don't really see any kind of hook there. Maybe this guy. Maybe. Don't really like that waveform, but yeah, that's a possibility. It would work as like a 50-50 around 50 cents. So if the target were to come back up to that 58-cent drop, then you can wrap it around 50 cents, and the low should be about 42 cents. Again, kind of works. It'd be like a local spring right here, little dip. Yeah. And then this move would have to be the outward move from 42 cent. Doesn't look like it'd be enough. I could break out here. So it's a maybe. Yeah, it seems to me like there's a possibility of a reaction move after it hits like 42 cents. That it would have to come interact with this target at 48, and then 50 cents, and then potentially up here, if it's a big enough swing, it could have a move right back up to 57. It doesn't get you out of here, but it's a good start. Let me see if there's anything else correlating to that point, because I'm not seeing anything. I'm going to remove these. None of them panned out. So let me check. Yeah, it might be that. That's right. That could give you a... All right, that's pretty slick, guys. Those 2 points. So that looks pretty good. So I think there's a decent possibility here that Thursday even you could get all the way back up there. But I feel like this wave has been largely dismantled. So I'm not sure what to make of that yet. Hmm. I don't really love it as a series of parallels, but it is there. I mean, at least to some degree, so I wouldn't ignore it. So there's a decent chance right here that you can get a move up to maybe. That's a big maybe. On the 30-minute, that's a jump over the moving average, which is kind of interesting. So it could be the beginning of something pretty big. But again, look at the wave, how it broke down, and then the lack of follow through here. I think this is the same mark we thought it was going to go to over here was 85 cents, which would have made more sense in terms of the distance that this traveled. We used the same thing here. We were trying to determine maybe where that middle was. So now it's hitting that same marker, but it's doing it really low. It's almost like this part of the S-curve either doesn't exist or it just slowed down like immensely. Maybe there's another one. I don't see it, but maybe there is one here, right here. Nah. It's kind of reaching. It's just trying to make it fit, but it doesn't really fit that well. So, yeah, so possible reaction up to 57 cents. I mean, there's enough going into that I could see that as a valid potential move. There's a lot of possibility there. There's a lot going on right here in the middle around 50. But beyond that, I think you'd be hard pressed to find another strong reaction in this until you start seeing some really major breaks. So if it broke out of that, if it came above 58 cents here, yeah, you could see a pretty strong reaction if it held. Sure, I think this could be a massive push-up. But there's enough going on diagonally that it's just like, who knows, you know? This could end up getting stuck pretty quick at any point. And then if it doesn't hold there, that reaction back down doesn't really mean a whole lot. You could just have it be like a macro distribution, which then goes even lower. So, yeah. Anything else you guys want to look at? Sorry it took me so long to do WTO. I haven't really messed with it very much. I keep kind of going back and just sort of reevaluating those curves, but it just didn't break out where it was supposed to back here. So it's kind of a mess now. I don't know. Maybe it was this reverse split too, to some degree. Maybe there's a disconnect because of what happened back here with the reverse split, and like maybe that's why it doesn't quite match up the S curve. I hate to say that like as an excuse, but is it a valid possibility? In my opinion, yes. There was a lot going on with AMC as well in our reverse split that kind of threw a bunch of wrenches into the chart. And it was easier to look at it afterwards, long term. But when it first happened, there was a lot of confusion, I think. Some of that rotation did pan out and some of it didn't. I guess that's all I'm trying to say. And I always wondered, maybe it's because of that change that was made could alter like the on balance volume coming in for good or for bad, which may affect the pacing. I don't know. I looked into this company a bit, WTO. It's a weird company. I think I talked about it a little bit. Yeah, it's just a strange company, man. Like, it's just odd. Yeah, I wonder if they're gonna go for a like another reverse split or something. Try to bring the price way down. doesn't seem impossible to me, which is not a good thing. Yeah, maybe that's why we go back up, So for me, I think if it comes back up to like the 70s or 80s, I'd probably be looking to cut ties with it for now and just see what happens. At least first to some degree. You look at profit taking, but really like it's just difficult because I think this has such a potential for a massive slide here. Yeah, around 75 cents. I mean, it could drop out at 14 cents or something on the chart. What's going to happen to it? I don't know, man. And the thing is weird about this is like you look back and you're like, well, it could also just rocket here and go up. Doesn't that look right? It's like, sure. I mean, there's a number of things that can happen. It just depends on like what people think the company's long-term value is. And if they think it doesn't have long-term value, then that's that. I spent about an hour and a half on AMC during this 2-hour stream. I'm not trying to be rude, but somebody asked. I've been taking requests. Somebody asked about WTO, so I talked about it. I hold WTO right now as well, but it was a time for requests. So we don't need to disparage what other people are doing with their time and money. If they want to invest in it, they can. If they don't have to. But I already talked about AMC. I did a huge review on it earlier in the stream. So I'm not going to go through that huge review again. This is pretty much par for the course in terms of a potential spring action. This was on the chart a while back. Presented that to everybody early in the stream and like walk through why I think is doing what it's doing. I also talked about it all day yesterday. So right now we're sitting about 442 and the price of this is, again, pretty much expected. Like it's very close to what maybe was anticipated here. I'm not really worried. I want to see what happens if it comes below 435 again. So in terms of major creek pushes here, things that maybe I didn't address earlier, right now it's going backwards to check a creek, which is fine. That's, again, wholly expected, wholly anticipated. There's really no drama about it at all in my mind. It's just going back down. It did come up, check this potential break here on this downtrend, which is kind of a widening as well. And then it pushed out high, and that to me is a distributive action. So it pushed out high, and then it came down, pushed out high again. So there's a little bit of a double topping action right here. It may look a little weird, but it's just what I call like the cat ear. It's just like a double check, essentially a double top. And that's it. What do I expect to have happen now? I expect it to come back down, and once it fills that gap, I think it's going to bounce. Maybe Wednesday might be a little bit green, potentially. And then Thursday probably red. And then I honestly think that Friday could be back to 450. And the thing is that when you look at the chart, if this comes down low on Thursday, and it goes ahead and makes its low on Thursday, and then Friday is more or less like a green day, your expectation of it coming back to 450 makes sense. And the question really is, does it come above it and rest above it, or does it stay below it? And it's not a coincidence, as most things aren't in the market, that I don't think that it's at all unreasonable to expect that, because yes, max pain tends to rule when we're not breaking out. Once we do break out, max pain is going to go out the window. But right now it's been like pretty consistent. So there's really no reason to like suspect it couldn't go right back to 450. What's interesting about that is you can see where that is on Friday. So if we look at the very end of the week, let me scoot this over a little bit. It's like right here. This is the close for the week. It could easily close at 450 and be above this creek. And it just depends. I would like to see it come and push resistance to like 460 again and then come back down to 450. That to me would be fairly positive on the week. Otherwise, if it comes below and kind of chops here or head fakes almost into that, I'd be a little more skeptical if it settles below it, So if you came up on Friday and just barely make it, to 449 or something into the day. I mean, that's just a huge gamble. Could it be positive? Sure, but it hasn't really made any confirmations. That's more likely what we would probably see if we're not going to get an answer this week. So, yeah. So I think tomorrow it's going to probably, if not today, end of the day here. I think tomorrow it's going to maybe dip to get that 438 and then should pop. And then it should come right back down and test that floor. And that should be like the spring. This is a potentially a good setup. I don't think it's great, but it needs to make another rise here before it drops. So it's a very easy week in some ways if it does this because it's very expected. So far, it's been very expected. So I take it there's no other requests because I haven't gotten any other requests. I did do a little bit of Doge yesterday. Did a little bit of GME today. Not much to say about it except that it's driven the price back down beneath this other trend, and I think it needs to come down to like 2150 to kind of do the major check that it needs to do. Could go lower, yeah, but for now, like that's kind of where my floor is. Until it breaks back above 2310 with some strength, there's not really any reason to go celebrating in the streets. It did, however, on this push-up, once again, gently raise the creek up a bit. So it's been doing it pretty much every time since July 16th. We had July 16th and September 9th, and now it's been kind of going up, testing it, retreating, testing, retreating, testing, retreating. But the retreats have been weaker, so if it continues to do the same thing, it should break, and it's very close, in my opinion, to that kind of final creek break right here. It's very, very close. Yeah, and then MPW, man, I just really want to kind of see it finish the down move. I've had open buy orders for this since I exited positions back here. I exited like 10% of my position in order to get better positioned. So that was a strategic move on my part. I don't know if that strategy is going to pay off, but what I'm going to do is I had an open order now for a certain price. If this comes down to below 550 or thereabouts, I'm definitely going to be looking at maybe adding myself. That's not a financial advice, it's just me. I think that's the main level that needs to be checked. So it should come pretty close to that, if not right on it. And then we'll see. I think that's enough of a back test here. Then it should just go. And again, expectations aside, do I think it rockets right now? I don't know for sure. Long term, this chart has a huge super macro breakout target of like $24. But like, that's because it's got this massive widening right here coming down. And there's a lot of noise over here from earlier, but the widening really starts back here in January 2022. So it's like 2 years of downward widening with increases in volume. And now their prospectus has changed quite a bit after fixing their problem with their largest clients. So yeah, doesn't mean it can't be a distribution right now. This could be a double top kind of thing. Could break down and slide pretty low or whatever. But I'm watching it carefully. I'm going to keep monitoring it. And all I can say is that it's got a pretty good chance long term, if it can hold this breakout, it's got a really good chance that it's going to come back up to near $20, which is pretty great return on investment, especially because it pays a dividend and all that stuff. So, yeah. Okay. That's good, man. I hope you guys have a great day. I'm done. I'm chill today. I just wanted to come on and kind of finish up what we started yesterday on AMC. Finish that retest or that retest. Finish kind of talking about like the reasons behind some of this stuff, and then maybe hit some of the favorites and move on. It's a simple week for me. I expect this is kind of the end all be all week in a lot of ways. I really do. But we have to sort of wait until Friday before we see how it finishes, which is a lot of days. I mean, that's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then I don't think this is completely separate from the Russell 2K. I think you have to do that back and forth check on the Russell 2K right now because it's in a very important position where the small caps could break. I'm not going to talk about world news. I know that people are concerned about stuff going on in the Middle East, but that's not really within the scope of the stream today, so I'm not going to do that. There's a lot to talk about with elections. There's a lot to talk about with world events, but those are things that they happen when they happen, for us to kind of concern ourselves with the future in that way, with wars and politics, politics is going to work itself out in November, and we've got October to kind of see it happen. With stuff about wars, I don't know what to say that hasn't already been said. I'm not a sitting here like as a candidate trying to earn somebody's favor. I'm not sitting here trying to express my opinions about war. And what couldn't happen. I mean, I think it's suffice to say that it's it would impact the market if something goes crazy. But like, when has that not been the truth? Like, it's always been the case. It feels pointless to talk about it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say on here for these purposes. But I do think it's important when we talk about TA just to consider maybe how those things play into, the big picture. It's just not what I was going for today. So, I know it's been a bit of a rough ride. We've had some pretty big ups and downs here on AMC, and especially the last 2 months been pretty rough on AMC. But sometimes you go through some crap, and that breakdown can result in a breakthrough. And you get to these points in life where there's kind of one failure after the next, after the next, after the next. And it may seem that way on AMC. It really may. But AMC always ends its accumulation ranges with some kind of like a weak, whimpery show. I mean, it's very rare that we see an accumulation on an AMC look really strong. They almost always look kind of weak at the end, and then they just go. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel one way or the other. Long term, I still have a lot of faith in those February targets that we have, which means that I don't really have a lot of concern, about the outcome of the day or the outcome of the week. I think the overall picture here is still good. And and aside from some crazy outlier event, I don't see anything particularly negative about this. I think it's just waiting for that creek jump. We haven't made it yet. When we make that creek jump, we're either going or we're going to distribute, and that's all there is to it. We just haven't done that yet. So, I mean, it's that simple. If I do come on tomorrow and you guys come hang out with me, just be prepared to maybe have some requests ready. If it's slow again tomorrow, it's kind of boring. I'd love to kind of explore some other charts and other sectors and see what we can find. I know there's plenty of other stuff to look at. We don't have to just look at weird small cap plays. We can look at other plays. Really quickly, last thing I'm going to say today, because we're kind of wrapping it up, is sorry, I just read something that was really interesting. Basically, we're sponsoring those folks that are helping with the membership. If you happen to get a membership, I think there's like 15 people now that have a membership. It's not like a huge number. I found out that apparently I had signed up for some kind of bonus program for YouTube. So I got like I don't remember doing it. And it sounds really weird because you're like, well, how would you not know you were doing it? I don't know. I know that I signed up. It must have been like what prompted to some degree, like to do the membership thing. Maybe that's what it was. I don't remember it. And so it was really odd for me because I got an email from YouTube and they were like, hey, you signed up for this bonus thing. And for every member that signed up, you get like an extra $10 or something. Well, if that's true, and I think it is, then we should have got like $100, and that's going to go towards that sponsorship program for the martial arts that I'm doing, the nonprofit startup basically. And so if that's true and I get that, then I've already kind of talked to my instructor, and we've got a single mom who can't afford to keep sending her kid to Taekwondo, and we're going to sponsor them. So I mentioned that before, but I want to mention it again. I hope it encourages you guys, because if that happens and it goes through and we have to wait for her to respond, it's completely anonymous. Like, it's not about me. It has nothing to do with me in some ways. I'm behind the scenes on all this. They won't know who it is, but their kid will get to continue. And that's just a really positive thing. So if that goes through, I'm definitely going to let y'all know as soon as I know. And that's cool, because that would actually be like the first ever. Whether or not it continues, whether or not it becomes big or it stays small, it doesn't matter. That's like real impact that y'all have helped make in somebody's life, you know? And money is a weird thing, right? It's like, it's very neutral. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. So for us to use it for good, I think it's a worthy thing to celebrate and to mention. And it's not about patting ourselves on the back or making ourselves feel better necessarily, but it does make you feel good to do good. And that way, I think again, we're kind of doing things here. We're learning stuff. We're exploring stocks together. And we're also, for some folks, we're also helping out people that are in need. And it's not like a cause that everybody's going to be 100% behind, but it's a thing that can really benefit some young people, you know, who need good mentorship and good athletic programs and can't afford it. So, yeah. Anyways, appreciate you guys. We will catch up tomorrow. If I can get on, I'll get on, and we'll do the same thing we kind of did today. And just come ready with some recommendations if you guys want to talk about some other stocks. Because I can't really go over AMC repeatedly more than like an hour every day. You typically kind of burn out, so there's not much else to say. So anyways, appreciate y'all. Hope you have a good one. We'll talk to you later.